So hi, I'm Martina, and I like to start with a red note post. It's a post that I share when I first start brainstorming my podcast. So I asked a simple question: would you listen to a podcast about retired athletes? And the most common reply was, only if they were famous. Honestly, those answers made sense. People who achieve extraordinary things naturally attract attention, and their story seems more exciting, more inspiring, and more worth listening to. But after reading those comments, I began thinking about one question. Why do some stories seem more worth listening to than others? I didn't find the answer right away. Instead, I began recording my podcast aiming to hear diverse stories on how they dealt with this life-changing stage. Among them, some had represented their country on an international stage, while others only participated in their province team. And when I was preparing for each interview, I noticed myself doing something I haven't expected. Whenever the guest wasn't well known, I prepared less. My expectations were lower. And without realizing it, I had begun to believe that an athlete's story could be measured only by their achievements. Although one interview completely changed the way I thought about stories. I was preparing for a conversation with a retired athlete, and she's a tennis player. And before we spoke, I looked through her athletic profile. She wasn't famous, and she had never represented the national team. And to be honest, I didn't expect this interview to be impressive. But then she began telling me about the years when tennis became something she wanted to escape. She talked about the pressure and her internal conflicts with herself and also her coaches. And even the point where she no longer wanted to be known as a tennis player at all. And some of her stories were deeply personal, so we chose not to include them in the podcast. But what surprised me, though, was what happened next. She didn't return to tennis as the athlete she once hoped to become. Instead, she rebuilt herself and her relationship with tennis, and in doing so, she also rebuilt her sense of identity. In college, she started training children to play. She still loved the sport, but tennis was no longer the only identity she allowed herself to have. She told me she hoped to become a businesswoman one day. Tennis had become a part of her story, but not the whole story. When our conversation ended, I had to admit that I have underestimated her just because of her resume. And this way of thinking wasn't just about athletes. It reflected something much bigger, how we value our narratives. We too often mistaken achievements as identity, and honors way too much in a story. And then I realized something. I wasn't only judging others through this perspective, I have been judging myself the same way. I spent most of my childhood figure skating, and I trained in an elite club, but I never became a professional athlete. Still, skating had changed my childhood. It had filled my weekends, my holidays, and for years, it shaped the way I saw myself. Then one day, I stopped. The 4-hour training I hated was gone, but somehow I felt empty. It was like a description of myself was no longer there. School carried on, but figure skating was becoming distant. And then whenever my classmates asked whether I used to skate, I would reply, well, I wasn't really a figure skater. Not because I haven't spent all my childhood skating, but because I didn't think I had achieved enough to deserve that title. And suddenly, I saw that I had made the same mistake I made when I first started my podcast. I believe that achievement decides whether a story counts. And I have even applied that standard to myself. However, if achievement doesn't determine whether a story is worth hearing, then what happens to someone who has already achieved everything? One of the athletes who helped me answer that question was Wang Jiachao. He participated in 2 Paralympic Games and won a gold medal in swimming at the London Paralympics in 2012. By almost everyone's definition, he had already achieved the highest point an athlete could hope for. And if success were simply about reaching to the top, his story should have ended there. However, it didn't. After retirement, he went to university, and there he discovered that para-triathlon was an unexplored area among Chinese athletes with disabilities. And then he said he saw an opportunity. So he founded his own coach, and he helped develop training methods that is suitable for people like him. He started from scratch, following a path that no one before him had taken. And eventually, he qualified for the Tokyo Olympics. And his medal was to finish in top 3. But sadly, he finished in 4th place. He told me about how after the Tokyo race was his darkest time, and because his expectations was top. But I asked him, does it help you redefine success? Because from our spectators' perspective, you have achieved almost something that we never dare to think. And he said, well, yes, winning a medal isn't the only way to succeed. Listening to him, I realized that success isn't something you arrive at once, and it is something you continue to redefine. He didn't abandon his identity of a swimming Olympic champion, nor did he let it become the only identity he ever had. He simply refused to let his greatest achievement become the ceiling of who he could be. And listening to these athletes, I gradually realized that they are not really talking about retirement. They are talking about something much familiar. What happens when the role we spent years building is no longer the role we're living? For athletes, that moment is obvious. They retire and their competition ends. But athletes aren't the only people who are experiencing this. One day when I was scrolling through Xiaohongshu, I came across a video encouraging women to return to work after years of being full-time housemakers. And one woman said, I was afraid to take the next step because I felt trapped by their identity and left out by society. That stopped me because I had heard the same fear from athletes before. And suddenly, I understood that this wasn't an athlete's problem. It is an identity problem that we all might face. All of us will eventually outgrow a role that once felt inseparable from who we are. We graduate and we change our careers. Our relationship may end. And sometimes even our greatest achievement become memories instead of milestones. The athletes I interviewed taught me something that I wish I had known a lot earlier. The goal isn't to hold on to an identity forever, nor is it to erase it once it's gone. It is to let it become one chapter of a much greater story. When I began this project, I thought I was documenting retired athletes. But then I wasn't. I was documenting the danger of confusing achievement with identity. Because once we believe that our values only come from our titles, we will begin to judge people by what they accomplish and not by who they really are. We stop listening to ordinary stories, and sometimes we even let that expectation happen on ourselves. So perhaps the question isn't whether a story is impressive enough to be told. Perhaps the question is whether we are willing to look beyond the title, because titles can disappear. So the next time when we meet someone, will you see the title or the story behind it? And I also hope that when one of your guys' titles disappear, I hope you can remember that even if the title may end, your story doesn't. Thank you.